Alrighty, hello everyone. So today we're just gonna continue with our discussion of all the ways we can convert our code into classes. So we're just gonna continue that step that we started last week. So there is our current piece of code that we have that we are going to work off of. So last time I uploaded it to GitHub, there were still some errors that needed to be fixed. So if we go ahead and we just give a run real quick, we can, oh, that's the wrong file. We can see that it's not exactly going to run properly as it's not a completed piece of code quite yet. This being because, well, we still haven't converted all the methods over yet. The main method being the initialization method right over here. Our variables still aren't all initialized yet, and obviously that is a problem. In this case, our initialization comes in the cases of creating our objects here, so this is actually a redundant function call. Instead, the initialization comes when we go ahead and we create these objects. So in our original run through, we created two classes, a paddle and a ball. Both of them aren't quite done yet, but there are some changes that of course do need to be made. So first thing that needs to be done is we just want to go ahead and make sure that we have the logic down. So obviously when we go ahead and we create our game, what happens is we want to make sure we know what everything means. And in the case of our class over here, we need to make sure we know what every variable is doing. And this is where it can get a little bit confusing with how self is exactly used. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, self makes it refer to a class variable. The class variable being any variable that is defined within its own initialization function right here. Well, this initialization function, it's a pretty broad pretty general description of what exactly does an initialization function do. Well, it starts up all these variables. And what happens when it starts up all these variables? Well, obviously they're going to have their set values. However, one thing that is extremely important to understand is that some of these variables are going to be called in other places in other sorts of ways, for example in these methods. So I'll give you guys about a minute to think about what do I mean by this. Alright, so what I mean is that some of these functions, the variables that you put in there are actually changing, and these variables are things called setters. Well, what is a setter? Well, obviously the name is referring to something, and in specific the something is a generalization of a type of function. And in contrast to a setter, there's something called a getter. Well, in this case we don't need a getter, because anytime we need to get any value within our function, it's already there as a class variable, and we set it that way for a reason. So first off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up something for you guys to see exactly what I mean by what is a setter and what is a getter. Best way you can do this is just Google what is a setter and getter in Java, or not in Java, in Python. right? So clearly you can see that there are a lot of little tutorials, lessons. Well, we're going to go with a trustworthy website that we can obviously go ahead and understand properly. So Medium, a very, very good website. However, I do like Geeks for Geeks better. So we'll go ahead and enter the Geeks for Geeks. And I can go ahead and paste the link to this in the chat so you guys can access it for yourselves. All right. So there's a lot of description of what these do. I'm not going to go ahead and explain what they're talking about here. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give a brief overview. Well, every single variable has a scope. Scope being where this variable can be accessed. I know I've talked about this multiple times. Well, sometimes you want to be able to call these variables outside of the scope. And suddenly, it doesn't become so easy to really understand what exactly is happening, right? Like, what's the point? Why can't I just define every single variable at the biggest scope so I can access it anywhere? Well, the problem with that is the fact that these variables can be hard to track. It's clearly possible. If you're doing some sort of small program, a program where there's not too many variables floating around, it's perfectly fine to go ahead, create all your variables as global variables. But as you get to more advanced levels of programming, where you're starting to do, 50 variables at a time, 100 variables at a time, having 100 global variables is an absolute mess. Imagine 100 lines of just you defining variables at the beginning of your program. That would be something to see, right? Obviously, what this getter and setter method is aimed towards is, sometimes there's some cases of variables where you're not really sure if you want to make it a global variable or a class variable, right? And instead of just, getting stuck over this decision, maybe just going ahead and putting it as a global variable, you can just create it as a class variable. And instead, it will change as an object of your class. So every single time you create an object of, say class geek over here, it's going to have its own separate variable of self.age, right? And self.age is obviously something that's specific to each object of geek. And as a result, you can go ahead and create this sense of almost a global variable, since all you have to do is write .getAge in order to get the age of the object. So that's kind of a brief overview of exactly what a setter and a getter method are and what their purposes are. And now that we kind of understand the basis of this, I'm going to explain why this applies to our program. Well, setters and getters have the basic fundamental idea of accessing variable values outside of the class. That's essentially the point of it. And in this case, we're going to do the exact opposite. We want to be able to access variable values from outside the class within the class, right? And this is going to involve the use of the parameters of our function. So you'll notice that we use self dot in every single variable here. However, this is in fact not correct. And the reason why it's not correct is because, well, frankly speaking, if everything was just set at self, then every single time we pressed any key or anything like that, then it would perform the same action over and over again, because the values are set and cannot be changed no matter what we do, right? Unless we write a setter method, obviously, but we don't have a setter method in here. Instead, we're just calling paddle movement and draw paddle. So that's obviously not the most efficient way of going about it. Now, could we go ahead and create a setter method? Yes, we could. But that splits it up into two steps that we don't really need. In the case of a setter method, the reason why you would ever use that is because you want to make a permanent change in the object. Something that, changes its actual value, and it stays at that actual value over time. In this case, if we were to change, the paddle velocity, that's only for the instant in which we are measuring the velocity of our paddle. This is in comparison to, say, if we create an object of, a student, and over the years, the student grows, an inch or two every single year. Well, that inch or two that the student grows is not just something that's measured, at the instant. Once they grow, they're not going to shrink again, right? So what's happening is we're just going to set that as the hard set value for that year. And, it's obviously not going to go up until the next year when that is remeasured again. So hopefully that analogy kind of makes sense. I know it's a little bit abstract at the moment, but it's something that you'll kind of get with more programming experience, understanding what variables you're going to want to access from function to function, and what ones you're going to need to change. So very first function here is paddle movement. Paddle movement is going to obviously control the movement of our paddle. Well, how does it do this? Well, let's look at this first if statement here. It grabs, alright, if self.paddle position 1 is greater than half pad height, and the paddle position 1 is less than height minus half pad height, then self.paddle position is adds self.paddle velocity. So something's happening here. First of all, paddle velocity, as we've talked about before, is something that is going to be accessed at the moment. It is going to change from time to time. What this means is if we were to go back into our Pong rewrite program over here, and we want to look at our moment where we kind of use this paddle movement function, we can go over here, right? Paddle movement, so first of all, we want to know where it's called. It's called right over here. There's two things that are passed: paddle position and paddle velocity. The position of the paddle always has to be there, right? It always has to be there because it's part of the paddle. The paddle obviously has to be at some place. However, the velocity of the paddle will change from time to time, and it's essentially the changing factor of this paddle. And when you are calculating the paddle movement, it's ultimately the paddle velocity that's changing the paddle position. So what's going to happen is, now that we kind of understand this, we go back here and we want to know, alright, well, paddle position is part of the paddle. So it would make sense that our paddle position is something that is defined as a class variable. However, our paddle velocity over here is something that is changing all the time. Is it okay for us to go ahead and just define this self.paddle velocity? Yes, it is. Now we go in here and we type in another paddle velocity. You'll notice it's grayed out. It's not getting called. Well, why is this? We have paddle velocity called right here, 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 and here. Well, the difference is this self dot. And when we remove this, you will notice that our paddle velocity is no longer grayed, meaning that it is actually being used in this function. And that is how our paddle movement is ultimately controlled. This is how we actually go ahead and change the paddle movement, right? Next one, drawing the paddle. Well, when we go ahead and we look at drawing the paddle, let's go right here. So when we look at drawing the paddle, there's a lot of variables that we have to account for. However, I will give you guys maybe 30 seconds to go ahead, analyze these three variables that are used, and tell me, are any of them variables that need to be changed to parameters, or should they all stay as class variables getting called as self dot whatever the variable name is? So 30 seconds to do that, and then we can come back and I'll tell you the answer. All right. So if you guys, did this, hopefully you will get the same answer as I did. Every single one of these variables should stay as class variables. Why is this? Well, canvas is, or actually, and the canvas is actually going to be a separate story, but that's because it's a special type of variable. We'll go ahead and go over that later. But starting from color, color is something where the paddle will never change. Unless later on in the program, if we are to draw the paddle again, where we change the color from green to red to orange to blue, say every 2 seconds or every time it hits the ball, then this will become a parameter. But it's not something that changes ever. Once it's set, right? Next one is self.paddle position. Well, paddle position, again, like here, is also a parameter. And the reason for this, it's all changed within the class itself. These methods here are the ones that are actually changing the values of the paddle position. So there's no need to go ahead and create this as a parameter. Is it possible? Yes, it is. But there's no need for it, because otherwise we would need to make a getter function, and that would just add an extra step. Now, canvas. Why do I say canvas is special? Well, canvas is a variable, but it's not really a variable. So a canvas is essentially, something you draw on. If you're an artist, then a canvas is, say a blank sheet of paper that you're going to draw, whatever you're drawing, right? Well, this canvas here is supposed to obviously store value, since it is a variable. But it's not really a value. Instead, it's more of a, it just acts as the entire canvas, essentially. So you're always going to need to set this as a parameter because of the fact that the canvas is always changing. From frame to frame, every single time you draw something, the canvas is changing. And there's nothing you can do to change that. So canvas will have to be a parameter. So we got our two methods down here. We made a couple changes with our self dots, naming each one of these variables. It is very, very, very important to understand the difference between paddle velocity and self.paddle velocity. If you're still confused about it, run it through your head, and if it still doesn't make any sense, feel free to ask any questions. But that is something that is very intrinsic to understanding how a class works and what's so special about a class, and why you should use a class, because this feature of a class essentially makes it more personalized almost, and this personalization is the entire reason as to why you would ever want to use a class. So now that we've established this, we can now move on to our second class, ball. We need to do the exact same thing that we did with every single one of these variables here. Well, unlike our paddle, ball has two class variables, making it a lot easier than our other one. So if we were to look at this, so we go through this, and I'm not sure if we finished this last time. I think we did, yeah. So essentially, ball movement. Well, ball movement actually is a little, it can be hard to understand at first. So first of all, one thing that we kind of didn't do is our ball position. That's a function on itself, and I'll let you guys think about that for a second. Why is this a function? It's one line. Why do I need to make a function, essentially? All right. Well, the reason why you need to make it a function is because, first of all, it has ball position in it. Well, why is it so special if it has ball position in it? Well, that means that every single time you call the ball class, you need to make sure you update the ball position. And that's the most efficient way of going about it. Unless in your main code, you want to make sure you do this every single time you call a ball class, but that seems awfully inefficient. And putting this as a separate method is a lot easier, right? So what we do is we can go here and, we can just go ahead and make our new method. We can define this as, say, draw ball. Like this is draw paddle. This will just become draw ball. And it's going to be a lot shorter of a function. So obviously, we have some errors here. Well, first of all, we remember that from our draw paddle, canvas needs to be passed down as a parameter. Second thing is ball position. Well, ball position, it seems like if we look over here, ball position is only one number. Well, how is it one number, right? It doesn't need an x and y coordinate. Well, we have to look at where it was defined and, obviously how it was determined to only need one as the position, right? Well, ball position is actually going to be a array. An array, if you're unfamiliar with the term, is going to be something that looks like this. Like that, right? That's an array. Very basic one. Stores a bunch of values. And you may be wondering, all right, well, why is this giving an error? If I go over here and, or not an error, why is this different than what's going on over here? Well, in this case, what's happening is the paddle position needs to actively be evaluated at all times. And what's happening is every single time you're calling at, position 1, position 0, what's actually happening is it's essentially just measuring, is this calculation or is this change in the paddle's location going to give me an error? Right? That's essentially what it's calculating. And if it is going to give me an error, then I'm not going to go there, right? Because obviously, if it did, then that would be bad for the program. Well, we come down here, and we notice, all right, well, ball doesn't have this kind of safety net almost, right? Well, obviously that's a good thing. And with this kind of removal of the safety net, we can see like this long piece of code here can get shortened into this small piece of code here. Now, obviously, this is in contrast to the fact that drawing a circle is less parameters than drawing a polygon. Well, what do I mean by this? If we go ahead and we go onto Google and we search up the draw package Python. There we go. I don't think that's a very reliable website. This is probably going to be the most reliable you are ever going to find, and the reason for that is because, well, it's the Python website. So this is Turtle Graphics. It is not going to be our draw, unfortunately. Is draw part of oh, it's part of Pygame. Pygame draw package. That's the name of it. This is, if you look at this, UC Santa Barbara. If you don't know what that is, it ends in .edu, meaning that it is some sort of educational website, which is the first clue. That's good. And the second clue is, well, it is an actual school. So based off of those two clues, you can think that this is at least a sort of reliable website that we can go off of. So we notice, all right, pygame.display. All right, so we're on the right track here. We got pygame.something going on, right? Well, pygame dot draw. Here we go. So dot draw rectangle has these parameters. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, except this over here has another separate 4 different slots that needs to be filled out, right? And this is in contrast to our circle, which has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but this one only has 2 inside it. So that's why it's going to be slightly shorter inside of our draw circle function in comparison to our draw rectangle, or no, draw polygon function. Hopefully that makes sense to you. I will give you guys about a minute to just catch up on what I said. I said a lot of things. I introduced a lot of new concepts. So again, a minute to just catch up, and then we will move on. All right. So hopefully you guys are still with me. Next thing that we're going to do is we want to create our main draw function. So in our main draw function, obviously there's a lot of things that are going on here. So first of all, we need 2 objects passed in here. First thing, or actually 3 objects. First thing that we're going to need is going to be our paddles. So paddle 1, paddle 2. We'll call those for now, right? Next one that we need is we actually do need to make our getter functions for our draw, or not getter functions. We need to call our functions from our classes for our draw method. So as you can see, paddle movement and our ball draw. I forgot. Draw ball. Yes, draw ball. That's what it's called. So those are the 2 methods, and then ball movement down here, and draw paddle. So all our 4 methods. So if we are to go ahead and just, uncomment all of these, obviously there's going to be a lot of errors. Not very pretty. Well, how can we go ahead and fix this, right? You'll notice that here there are errors on some of them, but not all of the errors, not all of the variables have errors under them. Well, first of all, we can call this as paddle 1 dot and paddle 2 dot. And what this is it's notifying that we are calling these as functions. And if we were to go back here, we can notice that our paddle movement needs 1 parameter. That's self over here. Does not count as a parameter. It's something that's filled out by Python on its own. So if you just have self in there, then it's blank. You just have an open parentheses, close parentheses, and that's all there. And you'll notice, all right, well, paddle 1 velocity and paddle 2 velocity are actually defined for us. As we can see over here, that's where they are initially defined. So that is kind of set for us already. However, we do need to make sure that it is a global variable. Otherwise, we are going to run into problems in the future. So that is where we're going to wrap up our class. So the step of fixing this part up over here. So we will just put continue over here to notify us for next time. Alright, so for this class, what we did is we started to understand the idea of class variables and the scope of variables and why it's important. So it's a very broad concept that is very hard to keep track of, especially when you get into higher levels of programming. You know, when you have multiple layers of methods and functions, keeping track of this all at once can be very tiring. So creating an efficient method for creating these layers from the start is very, very important. So hopefully, if none of you have any questions, I will be able to see you guys next week. If not, then it will probably be the week after. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And I'll see you guys next week. Thank you. All right, it looks like no one has any questions. So thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.